The morning of October 16, 1793, arrived cold and gray over Paris. Inside a damp cell in the Conciergerie prison, a woman who had once commanded the most glittering court in Europe prepared to die. At 7 in the morning, her maid found her lying on a straw mattress, hand pressed against her cheek, staring at the narrow window above. She wore black mourning clothes for a husband already dead 9 months. Her hair, once the envy of European nobility, had turned completely white. She was 37 years old, but she looked decades older. What Marie Antoinette endured in her final months was not simply imprisonment. It was a calculated campaign of psychological torture, physical degradation, and public humiliation designed to break the spirit of a woman who had once been Queen of France. The guillotine would be merciful compared to what came before it. The cruelty began long before her transfer to the Conciergerie. On the night of July 3, 1793, commissioners arrived at the Temple prison where Marie Antoinette was confined with her 2 surviving children. They had come for her son, 8-year-old Louis Charles, recognized by royalists as King Louis XVII after his father's execution, was being torn from his mother's arms. Historical accounts describe what followed as heartbreaking. Marie Antoinette refused to surrender her child, holding him tight as he wept and clung to her. The confrontation lasted over an hour as she resisted the commissioners. Based on what we know from contemporary accounts, only when faced with threats to her daughter Marie-Thérèse did the Queen finally relent. Louis Charles was taken away, and she would never see him again. The boy was placed in the custody of Antoine Simon, an illiterate cobbler appointed by the revolutionary authorities. Simon was chosen specifically for his cruelty and his hatred of the monarchy. Under his care, Louis Charles was locked in a dark, fetid room where he was starved, beaten, and forced to denounce his mother. The revolutionaries plied the child with wine until he was drunk, taught him to curse and speak in obscenities, and eventually coerced him into signing a document accusing his mother of incest. This false testimony would later be used against Marie Antoinette at her trial, one of the most vicious accusations ever leveled at her. For the remaining weeks in the Temple, Marie Antoinette stood for hours by her door, desperately hoping to catch even a glimpse of her son as guards led him to the courtyard. She could hear his cries echoing through the stone corridors. The sound of his suffering became her daily torment, a psychological torture more effective than any physical punishment. 1 month after losing her son, on the night of August 1, 1793, Jacobin officials woke Marie Antoinette at 2 in the morning. She was given minutes to dress and say goodbye to her daughter. Then, under armed escort, she was taken through the dark streets of Paris to the Conciergerie, a medieval prison known throughout the Revolution as the antechamber to death. Most prisoners held there never left alive. Life in the Conciergerie was designed to strip away every shred of dignity. Marie Antoinette was assigned the identification number 280 and placed in a small, cramped cell on the ground floor. The walls wept with moisture. The floor was stone. Her bed was a thin straw mattress with a tattered coverlet that provided no warmth against the autumn cold seeping through the walls. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the deliberate humiliation. 2 guards were stationed inside her cell at all times, watching her every movement. They never left, not even when she needed to use the toilet. She had to relieve herself in a corner of the cell while men stared at her, a woman who had once been treated with the deference due to a Queen of France. There was no privacy for dressing, no privacy for washing, no privacy even for grief. The guards watched her constantly, their presence a reminder that she was no longer human in the eyes of the revolution, merely a condemned enemy of the state. She was forbidden writing materials for most of her imprisonment. Her few possessions were confiscated. The revolutionaries even took away her knitting needles, depriving her of one of the few activities that might have provided solace. When she was occasionally permitted into the women's courtyard for fresh air, she was kept isolated from other prisoners, preventing any human contact or exchange of sympathy. The message was clear: she was to be broken completely before she was killed. The physical toll of her imprisonment was devastating. When Marie Antoinette had first arrived in France as a young Austrian archduchess, she had been celebrated for her beauty, her grace, her luminous complexion, and auburn hair. Now, witnesses who saw her could barely recognize the haggard figure before them. According to memoirs by her lady-in-waiting Henriette Campan, stress and grief had caused her hair to turn white. Campan recorded that after the failed escape attempt at Varennes in 1791, the Queen's hair had become as white as that of a 70-year-old woman, while the exact timing and mechanism remain debated by historians. The dramatic aging of her appearance during imprisonment is well documented by multiple sources. By the time of her imprisonment in the Conciergerie, Marie Antoinette's health had deteriorated dramatically. Historical accounts indicate she was suffering from hemorrhaging, likely uterine bleeding that left her weak and in constant pain. Multiple sources from the period mention her severe physical decline. She had grown painfully thin, eating only a few mouthfuls of broth each day. Her eyes were red and swollen from endless weeping. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale as parchment. The woman who climbed into the cart on that October morning looked nothing like the queen who had once dazzled Versailles. Several attempts were made to rescue Marie Antoinette from the Conciergerie, the most famous being the Carnation Plot in late August 1793. A royalist sympathizer named Alexandre de Rougeville managed to visit her cell and dropped a carnation at her feet. Hidden in the petals was a note outlining an escape plan. Marie Antoinette tried to respond by pricking a message into paper with a pin, but when one of the guards involved lost his nerve and exposed the plot, it failed. After the plot was revealed, Marie Antoinette was moved to an even more secure cell. Surveillance intensified dramatically. Any hope of escape vanished. On the night of October 12th, Marie Antoinette was roused from sleep and dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal to be formally indicted. She stood accused of conspiring with foreign powers, depleting the national treasury, and plotting against the security of the French state. Then came the charge that shocked even hardened revolutionaries: incest with her own son. This accusation, extracted from the terrified Louis Charles under torture and manipulation, was read aloud in the courtroom. When pressed to respond, Marie Antoinette refused to dignify the charge with a reply. Finally, her composure broke, and she appealed directly to the women in the courtroom, declaring that nature itself refused to respond to such an accusation laid against a mother. Even some of the market women who had stormed Versailles in 1789, demanding her head, found themselves moved by her response. But the trial was a sham from the beginning. Unlike her husband, who had been given weeks to prepare his defense, Marie Antoinette was given less than 24 hours. Her lawyers, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde and Tronçon du Coudray, begged the tribunal for 3 days to mount a proper defense. Their request was denied. Working frantically through the night, they prepared what defense they could, but everyone in the courtroom knew the verdict had already been decided by the Committee of Public Safety. Marie Antoinette's execution was not about justice. It was about symbolism. The revolution needed to erase the monarchy completely, and her death would serve as that final erasure. The trial began on October 14th and continued for 16 brutal hours. 40 witnesses were paraded before the court, most offering nothing but rumors and hearsay. The accusations ranged from the plausible to the absurd. She was accused of sending military secrets to Austria, of orchestrating orgies at Versailles, of declaring her son the new King of France. The prosecutors painted her as the Austrian she-wolf who had corrupted France and led it to ruin. They called her the instigator of all the tyrant's crimes, referring to her husband. Throughout the ordeal, Marie Antoinette sat pale and composed, dressed in the black of mourning, answering questions with a quiet dignity that unnerved her accusers. At 4 in the morning on October 16th, the jury returned. The verdict was read: guilty of high treason. The sentence: death by guillotine. Marie Antoinette showed no emotion. Witnesses described her as annihilated by surprise, her face a mask of calm even as her world ended. She had expected imprisonment, perhaps exile. She had not truly believed they would kill her. She walked back to her cell with her head held high, climbed the barrier separating her from the jeering spectators, and returned to the damp stone room that had been her prison for 76 days. In the hours that remained, she wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. It was a testament of faith, a declaration of her clear conscience, and above all, an expression of her devastating grief at leaving her children. She kissed the pages before handing them to the warden. Elizabeth would never receive the letter. It was intercepted and hidden away, not to be discovered for decades. After writing, Marie Antoinette tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. She prayed instead, finding what comfort she could in her Catholic faith. She refused breakfast, saying everything was over for her and food was pointless now. When morning came, the guards woke her early. She was ordered to change her clothes, and here came another deliberate humiliation. She had to undress and dress again in front of the guards, with no screen or curtain to shield her body from their eyes. She had wanted to wear black, the color of mourning for her executed husband. Instead, she was forced to wear a plain white dress, the color traditionally worn by widowed queens of France. A young guard stood watching as she pleaded for privacy to change her undergarments. He refused. Rosalie Lamorlière, her devoted servant, tried to shield her mistress with her body, but there was only so much she could do. For a woman who had once commanded absolute privacy and deference, this violation was a final, calculated insult. Then the executioner arrived with his scissors. Marie Antoinette's hair, what remained of it after stress had turned it white, was cut short to expose her neck for the blade. The locks fell to the floor, each snip a reminder of what was coming. She fashioned a linen cap to cover her shorn head, trying to maintain some small measure of dignity. Her hands were then bound behind her back, tied so tightly that the rope cut into her wrists. When she realized what was happening, she protested. Her husband's hands had not been tied when he went to his execution. Why should hers be? The guards ignored her. The bindings stayed. There was one more humiliation before they took her. Based on accounts from her servant Rosalie Lamorlière, Marie Antoinette needed to use the corner of the cell one final time before departure. The indignity of it, the reduction of a former queen to such circumstances in her final moments, was precisely what the revolutionaries wanted. They wanted her broken. They wanted the world to see that monarchy, that divine right, that royal blood meant nothing in the face of revolution. At 11 in the morning, they led her from the cell. An open wooden cart waited in the courtyard, the kind used to transport common criminals and garbage. Her husband had been granted the dignity of a closed carriage. Marie Antoinette was denied even that. She was made to sit on a rough plank in the back of the cart, her bound hands making it difficult to balance. A constitutional priest sat beside her, assigned to hear her final confession, but she ignored him completely. He had sworn allegiance to the revolution and rejected the traditional Catholic Church. To Marie Antoinette, his presence was meaningless. She would face death without his absolution. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. The cart rolled slowly through the narrow streets of Paris, and every inch of the route was lined with hostile crowds. 30,000 soldiers formed a corridor, not to protect her, but to prevent any last-minute rescue attempt and to ensure the mob did not tear her apart before she reached the guillotine. The crowds hurled insults as she passed. They called her the Austrian bitch, Madame Deficit, the whore of Versailles. They jeered and mocked and celebrated. Some accounts mentioned that not everyone was hostile. Some Parisians watched in silence, perhaps moved by the sight of a woman who had once been their queen, now reduced to this. But those quiet observers were drowned out by the voices of those who had come to celebrate her death. Throughout the journey, Marie Antoinette maintained her composure. Witnesses described her face as expressionless, her posture straight despite her bound hands. She stared ahead, refusing to acknowledge the taunts. At one point, the cart jolted violently over the cobblestones, and she nearly fell from her seat, but she caught herself. Jacques Louis David, the revolutionary artist, sketched her as she passed. His drawing shows a woman aged beyond her years, her face hard and worn, but her bearing still somehow regal. That sketch became one of the most haunting images of the French Revolution, capturing her in what many historians consider her final moments of defiant dignity. When the cart finally reached the Place de la Révolution, the crowd roared. The guillotine stood waiting, its blade gleaming in the afternoon light. This was the same place where her husband had died 9 months earlier. Now, it was her turn. As she climbed down from the cart, Marie Antoinette lost one of her shoes. It came off her foot and fell. Today, a shoe claimed to be hers from that day is preserved in a museum in Caen, though its authenticity, like many revolutionary relics, remains a subject of historical debate. She walked to the scaffold steps with her head high. Her hands were still bound behind her back, making the climb difficult. As she ascended, she accidentally stepped on the foot of Henri Sanson, the executioner. Her last recorded words were an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even in her final seconds, even after everything they had done to her, she apologized for a small, accidental offense. It was the instinct of a woman raised to be courteous, to be gracious, even in the face of death. The executioner led her to the plank. She was positioned beneath the blade, her neck placed in the wooden block. The crowd fell silent, waiting. At 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade fell. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the fall of the monarchy, was dead. Her head was lifted and shown to the crowd. They erupted in cheers, shouting, "Vive la République!" The revolution had claimed another victim. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave in the Madeleine cemetery, tossed into quicklime to speed decomposition. She was buried without ceremony, without dignity, in the same mass grave as common criminals. It would be more than 20 years before her remains were exhumed and given a proper burial alongside her husband in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. What happened to Marie Antoinette in her final months remains one of the most disturbing examples of how revolutions devour not just their enemies, but their humanity. The physical act of execution, the guillotine blade falling, was swift. But the months of psychological torture, the deliberate humiliation, the violation of privacy, the separation from her children, the false accusations, the mockery of justice, all of this was designed to destroy her spirit before they destroyed her body. In many ways, they succeeded. The woman who died on that scaffold was not the same person who had once danced at Versailles. Prison had aged her decades. Grief had turned her hair white. Constant surveillance had stolen any sense of safety. The loss of her children had broken something fundamental inside her. By the time the blade fell, Marie Antoinette had already died 1,000 small deaths. Whether she deserved her fate remains a subject of historical debate. She was not the monster her enemies painted her, nor was she the innocent martyr some later claimed. She was a woman caught in the machinery of history, a foreigner married into a dying monarchy, a mother who loved her children, a queen who made mistakes. But what was done to her before the guillotine, the systematic stripping away of her humanity, serves as a reminder of how easily justice can transform into vengeance. How quickly a society can lose its moral compass in the name of revolution. If you found this story as haunting as we did, leave a comment below. Tell us what struck you most about Marie Antoinette's final days. And if you want to hear more untold stories from history's darkest moments, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Codex of History. Because some stories, no matter how painful, deserve to be remembered.